December 16, 1944. The Schneifel Forest, along the jagged border between Belgium and Germany, was a frozen wasteland. Snow blanketed the trees in deceptive silence, while the distant rumble of American artillery punctuated the pre-dawn darkness. Gerrit Klaus Zimmermann, a young Wehrmacht soldier, knelt in the snow, his fingers raw and numb from the cold. In front of him lay 6 cigarettes, a meager daily ration meant to soothe 8 men. He tried to divide them fairly, counting fractions in his head as if calculus could stretch scarcity into satisfaction. Tomorrow, perhaps there would be 5 cigarettes if the supply truck arrived, if it had fuel, if it hadn't been strafed by American fighter planes that screamed overhead like angry hawks. 20 meters away, hidden beneath a tangle of pine branches, lay the body of a dead American soldier, a grim testament to yesterday's skirmish. Zimmermann rifled through his pockets and discovered a treasure far beyond anything his company had seen in months. 3 full packs of Lucky Strikes, along with chocolate bars, chewing gum, and instant coffee, a small bounty that revealed a staggering contrast. This single dead soldier carried more comfort than the entire German company had in weeks. It was a moment that would later be recalled in hushed tones, the quiet realization that the war was being fought not just with weapons, but with abundance itself. What Zimmermann could not have known in that frozen forest was that, just 4 kilometers away, American factories were humming at a pace the Reich could scarcely comprehend. Every year they produced 290 billion cigarettes for their armed forces. Hershey alone was crafting 24 million chocolate bars weekly, each meticulously designed to endure long journeys to distant battlefields. The mathematics of scarcity versus plenty were not being debated in staff rooms. They were being lived in soldiers' pockets. A Lucky Strike, a bar of chocolate, these were more than luxuries. They were harbingers of inevitable defeat for the Wehrmacht, symbols of a system that could care for its soldiers even amidst the horrors of war. Germany's ration system in 1944 existed more in theory than in practice. Officially, each soldier was entitled to a daily allocation that, on paper, seemed sufficient. 750 grams of bread, 45 grams of butter or fat, 120 grams of sausage or cheese, and 200 grams of meat when available. Cigarettes, 7 a day, or 2 cigars, were considered part of this standard issue. In reality, however, soldiers were lucky to receive 6 cigarettes. Often they were stale, captured from earlier French or Russian supplies, crumbling to ash at the first spark. Regulations like the promise of 7 cigarettes per day became a cruel joke as supply lines faltered under the weight of Allied bombing and fuel shortages. Zimmermann's discovery of American rations highlighted the Reich's fatal miscalculation. Industrial warfare was no longer won solely through strategy and valor, but through the ability to sustain soldiers materially and psychologically. Where German soldiers learned patience and suffering, American troops were taught a different calculus. Comfort multiplied morale, and morale multiplied effectiveness. Even before bullets were fired, this disparity whispered a quiet truth, one that German soldiers would come to understand painfully. Through months of exhaustion, hunger, and envy, as Zimmermann tucked a chocolate bar into his coat and lit a cigarette, the bitter smoke mingling with the pine-scented air, the soldiers around him exchanged glances that spoke volumes. These small comforts, once trivial, now carried the weight of an invisible battlefield. One fought in the quiet recesses of the mind and the empty stomach. In those fleeting moments, the forest became a stage for the silent war between abundance and scarcity. A war that would claim more than just lives, it would claim hope. The morning fog lifted reluctantly over the Schneifel forest, revealing the scars of the previous night's combat. Tree trunks bore jagged marks from artillery shells. The snow was churned with footprints and blood, and the air smelled of wet gunpowder and pine. Gerrit Zimmermann's unit was ordered to advance, each man dragging his rifle, his boots sinking into snow that had hardened into ice in the night. Hunger gnawed at them, but the memory of chocolate and cigarettes provided a strange kind of hope, a temporary reprieve from the bitter cold. As they moved forward, they stumbled upon a decimated American supply truck, overturned in a ditch, cases of canned meat, powdered milk, and coffee scattered across the snow. Zimmermann and his comrades paused, debating morality and necessity in whispers that barely carried over the wind. One soldier, Dieter, shrugged. Morality? We're already dead men if we don't eat. The irony was not lost on them. The war had transformed men into scavengers, rationing both life and ethics in equal measure. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the machinery of war marched on with relentless precision. Factories in Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York churned out cigarettes, chocolate, and canned provisions, feeding the thousands of American soldiers who would soon land in France and push toward the heart of Germany. In New York, a Hershey employee wrapped a chocolate bar for shipment, unaware that it would provide comfort to a soldier hundreds of miles away, possibly even in the hands of Zimmermann by some twist of fate. Each candy, each cigarette, was meticulously counted, wrapped, and distributed, as if the war could be won by ensuring no soldier went cold, hungry, or demoralized. Back in the Schneifel, the German soldiers struggled with the weight of their own scarcity. Bread had hardened into stones in their packs. Meat was a fantasy. Cigarettes were traded like currency. One cigarette might procure a piece of cheese, a sip of warm water, or a shared secret. Every ration, every crumb, was a reminder of the vast gulf between the front lines and the industrial heart of the Allies. Hunger was not merely physical, it became a lens through which the entire war was understood. Zimmerman lit another lucky strike, the flame flickering against the snow, and thought about the absurdity of survival. Here, in a forest of death and frost, a small candy bar could mean the difference between hope and despair. The Americans had understood something fundamental. War was fought not just with tanks and guns, but with consistency, planning, and comfort. The Wehrmacht had relied on valor and doctrine, but in this cold reality, doctrine could not keep men fed or morale high. By noon, the unit had reached a ridge overlooking a valley scarred with wreckage. American artillery fire shook the ground in intermittent bursts, reminding them that the war was a living entity, unpredictable and merciless. Zimmerman noticed a slight smirk on the face of one of his comrades, a fleeting acknowledgement of small victories, a chocolate bar eaten, a cigarette smoked. It was almost absurd. Victory in the snow was measured not by territory, but by these micro moments of sustenance and comfort. In the following hours, the men encountered more dead soldiers, both German and American, and each time, they scavenged, traded, and rationed. The disparity in supply was a silent teacher, revealing that in modern war, industry and logistics mattered as much as courage. Zimmerman's pockets were heavy now with loot, cigarettes, chocolate, instant coffee, even a small tin of condensed milk. Yet with each acquisition came guilt, a haunting sense that this sustenance was temporary, a fleeting advantage in a war that showed no mercy. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the snow, Zimmerman's unit huddled together for warmth. They lit fires with whatever they could burn, shared chocolate bars, and passed cigarettes like sacred objects. Around them, the forest whispered of death, survival, and the cruel mathematics of war. Zimmerman closed his eyes for a moment, tasting the bittersweet smoke and chocolate, wondering how such small comforts could hold such power. In those moments, he realized that the front line was no longer just a battlefield. It was a test of endurance, of morale, and of the invisible strength that only proper nourishment and small human comforts could provide. Night fell like a heavy curtain over the Schneifel forest, and with it came an eerie silence that only war could produce. The wind whispered through broken branches, carrying the faint smell of smoke and decay. Zimmerman's unit dug shallow trenches in the frozen ground, their hands numb, teeth chattering, bodies huddled together for warmth. Rations were scarce. Chocolate and cigarettes had been shared carefully, each man taking only a bite or a puff, knowing that the next day might bring even harsher conditions. By early morning it became clear that the supply lines were failing entirely. Trucks that had once brought bread, meat, and coal were either destroyed or stalled by relentless artillery fire and icy roads. Soldiers were forced to abandon heavy packs, leaving behind blankets and tools in favor of carrying the bare essentials, ammunition, rifles, and a few precious chocolate bars. Hunger gnawed at them in waves, not just as a physical torment, but as a mental strain. The men were not only fighting the enemy, they were fighting starvation itself. Across the front, the Allies were executing a different strategy. American units advanced with staggering efficiency, supported by trucks laden with food, munitions, and medical supplies. Hershey chocolate bars, once a symbol of distant comfort, now traveled in endless convoys, sustaining the morale of soldiers who would face the Schneifels' brutal winter. The contrast between the well-fed, well-supplied Americans and the starving, exhausted Germans was becoming painfully obvious. For Zimmerman, the disparity was more than a logistical issue. It was a daily, humiliating reminder of the shifting tides of war. The unit stumbled upon a small cabin in the forest, abandoned but stocked with remnants of food, tins of fish, dried bread, and, miraculously, a few American chocolate bars. The men devoured what they could, the sweetness melting in their mouths like a brief memory of home. But as quickly as satisfaction arrived, guilt followed. Every morsel stolen from the debris of war was a tiny moral fracture, a reminder that survival came at a cost beyond blood. Hunger sharpened instincts. Soldiers grew more suspicious, more competitive for the few remaining supplies. Friendships, once based on camaraderie and shared hardship, were strained by the relentless calculus of survival. A cigarette or a piece of chocolate was no longer a simple pleasure. It was a bargaining chip, a currency of power. Dieter, normally boisterous, grew quiet, eyes darting to see who might take the last scrap of food. Zimmerman watched, noting how the veneer of discipline thinned as desperation increased. Amid the physical suffering, the psychological toll became evident. Men hallucinated from cold and hunger, mistaking shadows for enemy patrols. Nightmares plagued their sleep, dreams filled with chocolate they could never reach and cigarettes that vanished in smoke. The forest seemed alive, conspiring against them. In whispered conversations, they spoke of home, of the foods they missed, the warmth of a hearth, the laughter of family, all things now impossibly distant. Yet, even in despair, small victories mattered. One soldier discovered a hidden cache of coffee, another found a few tins of condensed milk. These discoveries were celebrated with quiet reverence. as if each cup of coffee or bite of chocolate momentarily suspended the harsh laws of winter and war. Zimmerman recognized that it was not merely sustenance that gave them hope, it was the ritual, the shared appreciation, the fleeting reminder of humanity amid devastation. By the third day, the unit faced an impossible decision. Orders came down to advance further into the valley, toward positions exposed to relentless Allied artillery. The men were cold, starving, exhausted. Every step forward was agony, yet retreat was unthinkable. Zimmerman felt the weight of command in his chest, a suffocating burden compounded by the knowledge that their enemy was not just the Americans. They had supply, warmth, and morale on their side. The Schneifel Forest was no longer merely terrain. It was a crucible, testing the limits of human endurance, loyalty, and courage. As they prepared to move, Zimmerman glanced at the remaining chocolate bars in his pack, each one now a symbol of both hope and desperation. The men lit what fires they could, ate sparingly, and readied themselves. Tomorrow, the battle would continue, not just against the enemy, but against the very winter that sought to consume them. In that quiet, frozen moment, Zimmerman understood a bitter truth. In modern war, victory was measured not only in territory gained, but in the ability to feed, warm, and sustain the soldiers who fought for it. The first light of dawn revealed a forest transformed into a frozen wasteland, every branch and rock coated in a brittle layer of ice. The Germans' advance was slow, each step a struggle against deep snow and hidden roots. Zimmerman's unit moved in tight formation, rifles at the ready, but the cold sapped their strength, making even the simplest tasks monumental. Fingers stiff and numb fumbled with latches, triggers, and straps. Boots soaked from melting snow and frozen solid overnight made a hollow, crunching sound that seemed louder than gunfire in the eerie morning stillness. As they approached the ridge, the crackle of Allied artillery split the silence. Shells struck the forest with devastating force, sending plumes of smoke and splintered wood into the air. Soldiers were thrown to the ground, covered in snow and debris, hearts hammering, lungs filling with icy air. Zimmerman barked orders, trying to maintain cohesion, but panic crept in at the edges. Every man knew that the next shell could be his last. The men pressed on, hunger gnawing at their insides. The meager chocolate bars and coffee from the cabin offered fleeting relief, but the physical toll of the cold and exertion was relentless. A younger soldier, barely 19, stumbled, collapsing into the snow with a groan. Zimmerman rushed to help him, feeling the icy fingers of frostbite creeping up the man's hands and face. There was no time for proper care. Every second spent tending to one man was a risk, for all but the humanity in their midst demanded attention. Further along they encountered an abandoned trench, its occupants long gone, leaving behind discarded rifles, broken helmets, and half-empty ration tins. For a moment, the soldiers scavenged what they could. The discovery of a tin of sardines, a few pieces of stale bread, and even a lone chocolate bar sparked quiet celebration. The relief was brief. The ridge they needed to reach was exposed to the enemy, and lingering too long could invite death. Yet the chocolate-heat sweetness, the energy it provided, was enough to steel their resolve for the next push. As they climbed, the terrain betrayed them. Snowdrifts blocked paths, ice made footing treacherous, and every movement was a gamble. Artillery fire continued with grim precision. Zimmerman's mind raced through strategies, recalling training and experience. But even the best plans faltered under the combined weight of hunger, exhaustion, and freezing temperatures. The men relied on instinct and each other more than on orders or maps, their survival depending on trust forged in hardship. By midday, casualties were mounting. Soldiers fell silently into the snow, some wounded, some simply overcome by cold. The forest, indifferent to human struggle, seemed almost alive, mocking their vulnerability. Yet amidst the suffering, small acts of courage and kindness persisted. A comrade shared the last few bites of chocolate with a frostbitten friend, while another used his body to shield a comrade from the blast of a nearby shell. These gestures, fleeting as they were, became the thin thread that held morale together. In a rare lull, Zimmerman paused to survey the ridge ahead. Allied forces were entrenched, fortified by supplies, warm clothing, and ammunition. The contrast was stark and humiliating. Hunger, exhaustion, and cold had eroded the Germans' combat effectiveness, while their enemies remained strong and alert. Zimmerman realized that this battle was no longer simply about territory. It was a test of human endurance against nature, deprivation, and the unforgiving machinery of war. As the afternoon wore on, visibility worsened. Snow began to fall again, fine and relentless, covering tracks and muffling sounds. Orders were shouted through the storm, but their effectiveness was limited. Men lost each other in the blizzard, weapons froze, and the chocolate bars, once small sources of energy and hope, were now gone, consumed in desperate bites hours earlier. Hunger sharpened the senses but clouded judgment. Each step forward was a struggle, each breath a victory. Zimmerman pressed onward, driven by duty and the fragile hope that survival was still possible. The Schneifel was no longer just a forest. It had become a crucible of human will, testing limits that most men could not have imagined. And in the cold, in the hunger, in the relentless pounding of artillery, one truth became undeniable. War was no longer fought merely with weapons and strategy, but with the basic, often cruel necessities of life: food, warmth, and endurance. Night fell like a suffocating blanket over the ridge. The snowstorm intensified, blurring shapes and drowning sound. The Germans huddled together in small clusters, using what little warmth they could generate from each other. Frostbite had already claimed fingers, toes, and faces, and the soldiers knew that any delay in reaching proper shelter would result in permanent injury or death. Zimmerman's hands were raw and cracked, and every movement sent shooting pains up his arms. He wrapped his scarf tighter around his face, wishing it could shield him from more than just the cold. The hunger gnawed at them with a ferocity the morning chocolate bars could not quell. They scavenged the snow for anything edible: bits of frozen bread, scraps of meat from fallen rations, but each bite was tiny, barely enough to fend off the relentless hunger pangs. The men whispered among themselves about food, swapping morsels and encouraging one another to hold on. One soldier, shaking violently, confessed he hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. Another, clutching a chocolate wrapper, admitted it was all that remained of his own meager supplies. The ridge ahead seemed to mock them, a cruel silhouette against the dark sky. Zimmerman's unit was outnumbered, outgunned, and slowly being ground down by the winter, yet retreat was impossible. Allied forces had eyes everywhere, and the landscape offered little cover. Every movement risked exposure, every mistake a potential death sentence. Yet the men pressed on, driven not by strategy but by sheer instinct and the desperate hope that surviving the night might allow them to continue the fight. The cold was relentless. Breath crystallized in the air, forming clouds that clung to their faces like a ghostly mask. Shivering soldiers pressed together, trying to conserve heat, but the wind cut through every layer, chilling bone and sinew alike. Frostbite claimed the ears, fingers, and noses of those less fortunate, leaving behind numbness and pain that could not be shaken. Zimmerman's mind wandered briefly to home, to warmth, to food, but he pushed the thoughts away. Focusing on longing would not keep him alive. Survival demanded presence of mind, precision, and endurance. In the dead of night, a lone shot rang out, startling the soldiers and sending a ripple of panic through the ranks. A patrol had spotted movement near the enemy trenches. Zimmerman gathered his men, whispering instructions through chattering teeth. Fear was a tangible force, pressing down, threatening to overwhelm even the strongest. Yet amidst the terror, acts of heroism persisted. One young soldier ran to drag a wounded comrade out of the line of fire, exposing himself to the deadly night. Another braved the storm to deliver a small cache of supplies found in an abandoned supply tent. By the early hours of morning, exhaustion became an enemy as lethal as artillery. Soldiers fell asleep on their feet, weapons clutched in frozen hands. Some simply collapsed into the snow, their bodies too weak to move. Zimmerman shook men awake, using shouting and force when necessary, refusing to let them succumb. The forest was indifferent, the storm unyielding, but he had a responsibility. The survival of the men depended on him. Food, or the lack of it, was now a constant torment. Chocolate bars were long gone, and what little rations remained had to be rationed to the smallest fractions. Hunger distorted perception. Shadows seemed like enemies, the wind like whispers of mockery. Soldiers whispered prayers, some silently, others aloud, bargaining with fate for another day of life. Zimmerman counted heads, checked for frostbite, and ensured that no one drifted too far from the fragile line of the unit. As dawn broke, the snowstorm eased, revealing a landscape of silent devastation. Footprints crisscrossed the snow, and the bodies of the fallen lay scattered, some partially buried, some frozen stiff. Zimmerman surveyed the ridge, recognizing both the cost of the advance and the narrow margin by which they had survived. Morale was fragile, but determination persisted. They had endured hunger, cold, and constant danger, and as they prepared to press forward once more, Zimmerman knew that every step, every breath, every scrap of food would continue to be the difference between life and death in the unforgiving winter battlefield. By midday, the storm had abated, leaving a brittle calm that belied the horrors of the night. The ridge lay silent except for the occasional creak of ice or groan of a wounded soldier. Zimmerman's unit had pressed forward, inch by frozen inch, but the enemy trenches loomed ahead, a dark foreboding barrier against their weary bodies. Every step closer was a gamble, every movement a potential death sentence. Hunger and frostbite had taken their toll. Fingers were stiff and unresponsive, boots had frozen to the soles, and faces were mottled with the deep red and purple of exposure. The men moved like ghosts, eyes hollow but determined. Zimmerman knew that the first charge would be decisive. Hesitation would cost lives. He gathered his men, whispering instructions, his voice tight with tension. Stick together, cover each other, move fast, strike hard. The assault began quietly, with 2 men scouting ahead, slipping through gaps in the snow and shadows. A sudden crack in enemy sentry set off a volley of gunfire. Bullets tore through the frigid air, sending men sprawling. One soldier fell beside Zimmerman, clutching a shattered arm, screaming from pain and cold. Zimmerman dragged him into the shallow cover of a frozen ditch, pressing his scarf over the wound to staunch the blood. Survival was no longer just about enduring nature. Now it was about surviving the bullets and grenades that rained down. The main charge surged forward, men using bayonets in sheer desperation to close the distance. Hunger and exhaustion fueled a raw, animalistic strength. Zimmerman fought like a man possessed, leading the men over the parapets, hand-to-hand combat erupting amidst the snow and ice. The smell of gunpowder and blood mingled with the cold air, stinging the lungs. Shouts and cries echoed across the battlefield, punctuated by the distant roar of artillery. Every frozen second was a battle for life. Soldiers stumbled, fell, and rose again, refusing to surrender to pain or fatigue. One young recruit, barely 16, was hit in the leg but refused to leave his post, dragging himself forward with grim determination. Another soldier, blinded by frostbitten tears, managed to throw a grenade into an enemy bunker, silencing machine gun fire that had pinned down the entire unit. Zimmerman's own hands bled as he wielded his weapon, fingers stiff and cracked, but his focus remained unwavering. Hours passed in what felt like minutes. The enemy was pushed back, but not without a heavy cost. Zimmerman's unit had taken casualties, some bodies left where they fell, others dragged back to makeshift shelters. Hunger gnawed at them still, but adrenaline and survival instinct pushed them forward. They scavenged what supplies they could from the fallen enemy, taking chocolate, bread, and even small cans of meat. It wasn't enough to fill their stomachs, but it was enough to keep the mind alive. As evening approached, the battlefield was a frozen graveyard. Smoke rose from fires lit to keep some semblance of warmth, shadows dancing across the snow. Zimmerman counted the men who remained, each face etched with exhaustion, fear, and unspoken grief. They had survived the storm, the hunger, and the enemy, but the cost was visible in every frozen limb, every hollow stare, every whispered prayer for another day. Zimmerman allowed himself a brief moment to reflect. The ridge had been taken, but it had demanded everything from them. Survival wasn't just a matter of skill or courage, it was a relentless test of endurance, of pushing past the limits of the human body and spirit. The soldiers huddled together, sharing warmth and scarce food, knowing that tomorrow would bring another battle, another challenge, and that their greatest weapons were not rifles or grenades, but resilience and unity. In the fading light, Zimmerman looked over the ridge, seeing both the destruction and the fragile hope that persisted. They had endured, and in that endurance, they found strength. The night would come again, but they were ready, scarred, hungry, and frostbitten, yet unbroken. Night descended like a heavy blanket over the ridge, the temperature dropping even further, sharp enough to bite through layers of clothing. The surviving soldiers huddled close to the feeble fires they had managed to light, the warmth barely penetrating the frozen air. Every crackle of burning wood seemed amplified in the silence, a fragile heartbeat in the midst of a battlefield that had become a graveyard. Zimmerman walked among his men, checking for signs of frostbite and exhaustion. Faces were pale, eyes hollow, lips cracked and blue. Some sat in silence, staring at the fire as if it might offer answers that didn't exist. Others whispered the names of fallen comrades, voices trembling between grief and disbelief. The weight of survival pressed down on everyone, but Zimmerman knew they had no choice but to carry on. "Tomorrow, we move again," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The ridge had been taken, but the supply lines were stretched thin, and the enemy still lingered beyond the next hill. Every decision was a matter of life and death, and one wrong move could undo everything they had fought for. Private Lenz, barely able to hold his rifle due to frostbitten hands, shivered violently as he spoke. "Sir, how do we keep going like this?" His voice was hoarse, each word a labor. Zimmerman crouched beside him, resting a firm hand on the young soldier's shoulder. "We take it one step at a time, 1 hour, 1 minute. We don't think about tomorrow right now. We survive tonight, and then we face what comes next." The soldiers tried to sleep, but the cold and the memory of the day's violence made rest elusive. Dreams were haunted by the screams of fallen friends, the whistle of bullets, the snap of grenades. When dawn broke, it brought no relief, just a pale gray light that revealed the extent of their suffering. Bodies lay frozen where they had fallen, some partially buried in snow, a grim reminder of the cost of war. Zimmerman called for a quick muster, surveying the men who remained. Morale was fragile, but he saw in their eyes a spark that hadn't been extinguished. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs, fatigue weighed down every limb, yet there was a determination to continue, to honor the fallen by surviving, by fighting another day. Supplies were scarce. Rations salvaged from the previous battle had nearly run out, and the unit had to forage through the frozen landscape to find anything edible. Every small victory, a handful of dried meat, a piece of chocolate, a few hard biscuits, was celebrated, a fleeting reprieve from the relentless harshness of their environment. By midday, scouts returned with news that the enemy was regrouping just beyond the next ridge. Zimmerman gathered his remaining soldiers, their bodies aching, their spirits frayed, and laid out the plan. "We hold what we have, we fortify, we survive, and when the time comes, we strike again, but carefully. No heroics, no unnecessary risks. Every life counts." The men nodded, understanding the gravity of the words. Survival was no longer just about courage, it was about strategy, patience, and endurance. Zimmerman felt the weight of command pressing down on him, but he also felt a quiet pride. Against impossible odds his men had endured. They were battered, broken in some ways, yet unyielding in their will to survive. As the day wore on, the wind howled over the ridge, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and blood. Zimmerman's unit dug shallow trenches, reinforced makeshift barricades, and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. Every movement was deliberate. Every sound of the wind made them flinch, alert to the possibility of an ambush. And yet, despite the hardship, there was a strange camaraderie in the cold, a bond forged in shared suffering. A smile, a whispered joke, a helping hand. It was these small moments that reminded them they were still human, that they still had hope. Zimmerman looked out over the frozen expanse, the ridge stretching endlessly before him. He knew the road ahead would be brutal, that more losses would come, but he also knew that as long as his men held together, as long as they endured, they could face whatever horrors awaited. The battle was far from over, but the heart of survival beat strong in the frozen night. The morning fog clung stubbornly to the ridge, blurring the line between earth and sky. Visibility was poor, and every shadow seemed alive with threat. Zimmerman moved silently among his men, their breath rising in clouds, rifles clutched tightly against their chests. The enemy had not waited, they were already probing, testing the edges of the frozen defenses. A sudden crack echoed across the ridge, followed by the sharp ping of bullets striking metal. The unit dropped into position, hearts hammering, eyes scanning for movement. A squad of scouts returned fire, their rifles barking into the mist. The skirmish was brief but brutal, a reminder that the ridge was far from secure. Zimmerman barked orders, directing men to reinforce barricades while others fired suppressive shots to keep the enemy at bay. Minutes stretched like hours as the fog swirled around them, muffling sounds and disorienting both sides. Lenz, shivering but resolute, peered through the scope of his rifle, catching fleeting glimpses of the enemy. "Sir, they're trying to flank us," he shouted, voice trembling. Zimmerman's jaw tightened. "Hold the center. Reinforce the left flank. Nobody falls back without my command." Every word carried weight. Hesitation could mean death. Soldiers scrambled, snow crunching underfoot, moving with a precision born of desperation and training. Amid the chaos, a small group of enemy combatants managed to breach the barricade. Close combat erupted, a chaotic flurry of bayonets, fists, and rifle butts. Zimmerman fought alongside his men, every movement calculated, adrenaline sharpening his focus. Blood mingled with snow, red stark against the white, and the stench of gunpowder hung thick in the air. Hours dragged on. The ridge became a maelstrom of motion, survival, and sheer will. Zimmerman's voice, hoarse from shouting, carried over the din. "Keep it together. For every man we've lost, for every life still here we fight." By midday the enemy began to pull back, having sustained heavy losses. Zimmerman counted heads, checked for injuries, and assessed the barricades. The ridge still held, but barely. Exhaustion was evident in every step, every sigh, every tremor of the hands that still clutched rifles. In a rare moment of quiet, Zimmerman surveyed the battlefield. Fallen comrades lay scattered across the frozen landscape, their sacrifice carved into the ridge. He felt the weight of command more keenly than ever, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and relentless determination. "Stay alert," he muttered, almost to himself. "They'll come again." As the day waned, the soldiers scavenged for supplies and tended to the wounded. The camaraderie that had formed through shared suffering became their shield against despair. Even in exhaustion, small gestures, a shared morsel of food, a reassuring pat on the shoulder offer fleeting warmth. Zimmerman walked a perimeter, listening to the wind howl, carrying the distant echoes of gunfire from other ridges. The enemy was persistent, clever, and cruel, yet his men had endured. Against impossible odds, they had not only survived, they had stood their ground. That night, as another bitter cold set in, Zimmerman allowed himself a moment of reflection. Every scar, every bruise, every sleepless hour was etched into their collective memory. Survival was not just a matter of strategy or strength, it was courage, unity, and the relentless refusal to give in to despair. He looked up at the stars, barely visible through the haze, and whispered a silent vow. "We endure, we survive, no matter what comes next." The ridge remained contested, the battle far from over, but the heart of the unit beat strong. Tomorrow would bring more trials, more violence, more loss, but for now, they had held, and that was enough to keep hope alive. Dawn arrived like a thin promise, pale and fragile over the ridge. The fog had lifted, revealing the full scale of the battlefield. Bodies of the fallen lay frozen, their faces etched with the terror and determination of the previous day. Zimmerman moved among his men, scanning the horizon, senses sharpened by exhaustion and dread. The enemy would return, and soon. Reports came in from scouts. Enemy reinforcements were advancing, moving with precision and deadly intent. Zimmerman's chest tightened. The ridge was barely holding, supplies were dwindling, morale strained to the breaking point. Every soldier knew that the next confrontation could be the one that decided everything. "Form ranks," Zimmerman commanded, voice cutting through the morning chill. "We hold the line. No one steps back without orders." The soldiers obeyed, faces pale, eyes hollow but resolute. Lenz checked his rifle, hands trembling. "Sir, they're not far now, maybe a few 100 meters. They'll hit hard." Zimmerman nodded, swallowing the knot of anxiety in his throat. Then we hit harder. The first shots rang out like a signal bell. The enemy attacked with ferocity, their movements coordinated, relentless. Bullets zipped through the air, striking wood, metal, and flesh. Zimmerman's men fired in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, buying precious seconds. Close combat erupted again along the ridge. The sounds of gunfire, shouts, and pain melded into a grim symphony of survival. Hours passed in a blur. The cold gnawed at exposed skin. Exhaustion clawed at every mind and muscle, yet retreat was unthinkable. Zimmerman moved from point to point, giving orders, tending to the wounded, and rallying those who faltered. Every decision carried weight. One misstep could doom them all. At the left flank, a group of soldiers struggled against a sudden breach. Zimmerman ran to their side, heart hammering. "Hold, don't let them through." He fought alongside them, bayonet meeting bayonet, grit against force. Sweat froze on his brow. The snow beneath him was slick with blood and ice. Meanwhile, Lenz spotted enemy artillery moving into position. "Sir, they've got heavy guns." His voice trembled, fear unmasked by adrenaline. Zimmerman clenched his jaw. "We adapt, we survive. Fall back in formation if we must, but we do not break." The enemy unleashed volleys, shaking the ridge, tearing through defenses, forcing pockets of soldiers to retreat under cover fire. Zimmerman coordinated counterattacks, using every resource, every ounce of energy left in his men. The battle had become a test not just of skill, but of willpower. By late afternoon, the tide of the battle shifted. The enemy, weary from their relentless assault and facing unexpected resistance, began to falter. Zimmerman ordered a calculated push forward. His soldiers, fueled by determination and survival instinct, advanced, reclaiming ground lost earlier. Silence fell over the ridge, broken only by the wind whistling through jagged rocks. Both sides had suffered devastating losses, yet Zimmerman's unit remained standing, battered but unbroken. He gathered the men, scanning their weary, bloodied faces. "You've done what many thought impossible," he said quietly. "We've survived. We've held the ridge. But remember, tomorrow is another fight. And we will face it together." In that brief moment, hope flickered amid the ruin. The ridge had been a crucible, testing courage, loyalty, and endurance. Zimmerman knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew the heart of his men was unbreakable. As night descended, the ridge was quiet once more. The stars pierced the dark sky, distant yet constant, reminding them that even in the harshest storm, some light endures. Nightfall blanketed the ridge, but sleep was a luxury none could afford. Fires smoldered, casting weak light over the battered soldiers. Zimmerman walked slowly among them, surveying the aftermath. Faces streaked with grime, eyes hollow, bodies bruised and bleeding, each one a testament to the horrors they had endured. He knelt beside a young soldier, barely 17, shivering despite the layers of clothing. "You fought well," Zimmerman said softly, resting a hand on his shoulder. The boy nodded, too exhausted for words, tears streaking through the grime. Lenz approached, carrying a satchel of supplies. "Sir, the medics are overwhelmed. We've lost too many." His voice cracked, betraying his fatigue and sorrow. Zimmerman exhaled heavily. "I know I've counted each one, and I will carry their memory with me. But we still have to move forward. Tonight, we recover. Tomorrow, we fight again." The men huddled in small groups, sharing what warmth and comfort they could. Silence settled unevenly over the ridge, punctuated by the occasional cough or groan. Every soldier wrestled with his own thoughts, fear, anger, grief, but also an unwavering determination to survive. Zimmerman found a quiet spot near the ridge's edge and stared out over the battlefield. The snow, once pristine, was now stained red. Shadows of the fallen stretched across the ice, haunting reminders of what had been endured. The wind carried the distant echoes of the enemy's retreat, a temporary lull in the storm that seemed endless. He thought of his family back home, the life he had left behind, the promise of returning. Yet, in that moment, the ridge was all that mattered, the lives of the men who relied on him, the fragile hope that they could hold together against whatever came next. Lenz joined him, standing silently for a moment before speaking. "Sir, do you think we'll make it through this?" Zimmerman's gaze never wavered from the horizon. "I don't know, but as long as we stand together, we have a chance. And we will take it, one step at a time." A faint sound reached them, the low murmur of enemy scouts at the perimeter, testing defenses. Zimmerman's jaw tightened. "We rest, but we do not let our guard down. Tomorrow, they will return, stronger, and we must be ready." The ridge seemed to hold its breath, suspended between the despair of loss and the fragile spark of hope. Zimmerman knew that leadership was more than orders and strategy. It was the courage to face fear, to carry the weight of others' lives, and to inspire them to do the same. Through the long night, he kept watch, listening, waiting, ensuring that the men under his command were safe, if only for a few precious hours. Each heartbeat was a reminder that survival was both fragile and tenacious. And somewhere deep within, Zimmerman knew that despite the scars, the pain, and the losses, they would endure. As the first hints of dawn touched the ridge again, a quiet determination settled over the soldiers. The battle was far from over, but they had survived the crucible of the ridge, and in survival, they found strength that would carry them into whatever horrors awaited with the rising sun. Dawn broke with a muted light, barely piercing the heavy clouds above the ridge. Scarred and silent, seemed to hold its breath. Zimmerman moved among his men, checking positions, urging those who were still struggling to rise. Every face told the same story: exhaustion, grief, yet beneath it, a stubborn spark of resolve. Enemy movement, 12 o'clock. A scout called, breaking the fragile morning calm. Zimmerman grabbed his binoculars, scanning the distant tree line. Shadows shifted, small groups of enemy soldiers emerging cautiously from cover. They had been regrouping overnight, learning, adapting. The realization tightened Zimmerman's chest. This would be the fiercest engagement yet. He turned to his officers. Positions. Hold fast, conserve your strength, and do not let them break us. Today, we show them what it means to face men who will not yield. Orders were relayed quickly, precision born from necessity. Every man knew the stakes. Every man understood the consequences of failure, yet fear lingered beneath the surface, a constant companion. Zimmerman felt it too, but he swallowed it, letting it transform into focus, into clarity. The first shots rang out as the enemy advanced, rifles cracking, artillery booming. The ridge erupted into chaos once more. Zimmerman moved along the lines, shouting instructions, offering encouragement, steadying hands trembling with adrenaline and fatigue. A young soldier fell nearby, clutching his leg. Without hesitation, Zimmerman knelt beside him, tearing his coat to fashion a tourniquet. "Hold on, you're going to be all right." The boy nodded, pain etched across his face, but survival burning in his eyes. Hours blurred together. Every advance of the enemy was met with resistance, every charge repelled with grit and determination. Zimmerman's mind cycled between strategy and the immediate needs of his men. He barked orders, pulled wounded from the line, and, when he had a brief moment, allowed himself a glance at the horizon. The ridge. Still theirs, still standing against the onslaught. By afternoon, the enemy began to falter, their assaults losing coordination, their morale crumbling against the relentless defense. Zimmerman knew this was the turning point. With a calculated counterattack, he signaled his men forward. The ridge trembled with the momentum of their advance, each step reclaiming ground, each shout asserting defiance. When the dust settled, silence enveloped the battlefield. The enemy had retreated, leaving behind the echo of their defeat. Zimmerman surveyed the ridge, wary but resolute. His men were battered, some grievously so, but they had endured, they had survived, they had triumphed. He stood alone for a moment, taking in the devastation, the frozen snow marked with footprints of struggle, the smoke curling into the sky, the wounded scattered among the fallen. He bowed his head for a brief instant, honoring the sacrifice of those who would never see another sunrise. Then, lifting his gaze, he turned to the living. "We fought and we held, but survival is not enough. We honor those who gave everything by living, by standing, by never forgetting. Today, we are stronger, and we are united." A quiet murmur of agreement rippled through the soldiers. Exhaustion mingled with relief, fear tempered by pride. In the distance, the sun broke fully over the ridge, bathing the snow in a pale golden light. It was a small, fragile victory, but it was theirs. Zimmerman felt the weight of leadership settle differently now, heavier yet clearer. He knew more battles would come, more sacrifices demanded. But he also knew this courage, unity, and determination could carve triumph from despair. And on this ridge, against impossible odds, they had done exactly that. The days following the battle were eerily quiet. The ridge, once filled with the roar of gunfire and the cries of the wounded, now lay in solemn stillness. Snow, falling gently, blanketed the scarred earth, softening the jagged reminders of conflict. Zimmerman walked among his men, checking on those recovering, offering words of encouragement, and listening to the stories of survival that now wove the fabric of their shared memory. Letters from families arrived, bringing both joy and grief. Some faces lit up with news from home, while others trembled as they read of losses that had arrived during their absence. Zimmerman understood the weight of these messages. Each soldier carried them silently, alongside the echoes of battle that would never fully fade. In the evenings, around makeshift fires, the men spoke less of strategy and more of life, of dreams postponed, of loved ones waiting, of a future still uncertain. Zimmerman joined their conversations sparingly, preferring to listen, knowing that leadership sometimes meant holding space for others' fears and hopes more than issuing orders. The ridge, once a theater of violence, became a place of quiet reflection. Memorials were fashioned from the remnants of battle, simple crosses of wood and stones, each one marking a story, a sacrifice. Zimmerman paused at each marker, bowing his head, offering silent words of thanks to those who had given everything. Despite the scars both seen and unseen, there was a sense of resilience that lingered among the men. They had survived what many thought impossible. They had stood against overwhelming odds and emerged not unscathed but unbroken. Zimmerman felt a deep pride in them, a respect forged in the crucible of shared struggle. He knew the world beyond the ridge would not wait for healing, that life and conflict would continue elsewhere. Yet, here, among these men, there was a lesson that could not be undone. Courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to stand in its face. Unity was not just a strategy, but a bond that could carry them through the darkest moments. And survival was not merely living, but honoring every breath and every fallen comrade by moving forward. As the sun set, painting the horizon with streaks of orange and crimson, Zimmerman finally allowed himself to breathe, to feel the weight of relief and gratitude. He looked at his men, tired but steadfast, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of peace. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, almost to himself, "we rebuild, we remember, and we continue." The ridge, once a symbol of struggle, now stood as a testament and enduring reminder that, even in the harshest of winters, life, courage, and hope could prevail. And as the stars appeared above, faint against the fading light, Zimmerman knew that though the battle was over, the spirit of those who had fought would never fade. The men, their faces illuminated by the fire and the stars, felt it too, the quiet, unspoken bond of survival, sacrifice, and the promise of a future forged from the trials of yesterday. And so, on that ridge, amidst the snow and the silence, life went on, carrying with it the memory of bravery, the lessons of endurance, and the enduring hope that even after the darkest night, dawn would come.